morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the next edition of Leadership Conversations, brought to you by Ashank Desai Centre for Leadership and Organisation Development at IIMA Ahmedabad. I am Vishal Gupta, chairperson of the centre, and I am very honored to have with us a dear friend and an eminent scholar, Professor Jonathan Gosling, who would be talking about a very interesting topic to us today, titled The Pleasures of Power, A Leader's Guide. In this talk, Professor Jonathan would be talking about how do we identify several different pleasures of power that appeal to different leaders. Also, how does one maybe identify the pleasures they seek in the positions and then maybe pace their careers accordingly. So this is a very, very fascinating topic, the power and the pleasures of power. And we look forward to having this conversation with Professor Jonathan Gosling. Before we go there, let me introduce Professor Jonathan to all of you. Professor Jonathan Gosling is Emeritus Professor of Leadership at Exeter University in the UK and a visiting scholar at other universities including Bled, McGill, Monash, Renmin, and UWE. He has taught and researched leadership for over 30 years and is now an independent academic and consultant at penumbra.com. Current projects of Professor Gosling include the Forward Institute promoting responsible leadership in government, NGOs and businesses, supporting the frontline leadership of HIV and malaria control programs in Southern Africa, and running a collaborative mindset module for McGill. He has represented UK universities at the Rio +20 UN Sustainability Summit and contributes to the greening of management education. For example, as co-author of the textbook Sustainable Business, a One Planet Approach, and co-founder of One Planet Education Network, Open. He worked many years as a community mediator, co-founded coachingourselves.com, and received the ILA's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2021. Jonathan is a keen sailor and a family man. I have had the pleasure of meeting him and spending some time with him when he visited IIMA Ahmedabad in the year 2018-19, and we've had many conversations on leadership and related topics. So it is a pleasure having Jonathan back with us, and we look forward to this talk. So the format of the talk is going to be, we'll have Professor Jonathan make few remarks at the beginning, and then we will have a free-flowing conversation where we'll take questions. We'll pose some questions that I have. I'll take some questions that the audience would write to us, and we'll engage in a dialogue with Jonathan. So Jonathan, I invite you to share your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Vishal. I can say it's a great pleasure to be joining you. I wish I was there in pleasure. And thanks also to the colleagues of the Ashank Desai Centre for Leadership Development and Organisational Development, because it's a great privilege to meet with and have the opportunity to talk with so many very skilled and experienced colleagues, both scholars and practitioners. I'm going to go quite quickly and directly into the main point of my argument and assume that I will certainly leave out a lot of things and maybe provoke some questions and hope we can deal with those. I'll just share my screen. So I hope you can now see this, this man obviously rather enjoying striding across the great stage and enjoying his evident power. And I'm going to talk today about the pleasures that people have in power, but I don't want to make it all about what one might call the perverse pleasures of power. My argument is going to be mainly that in order to take up leadership, to take initiative in doing anything, you really need to be able to generate some pleasure in exerting power. So I'm going to invent, just for this next hour or two, a verb which you're welcome to throw away afterwards, but let's call it powering. Just like we talk about leading, or we talk about walking or striding, like President Putin is in this picture. I'm going to talk about powering as something we do and something one can enjoy in a number of different ways and gain some different pleasures from it. And I'm going to start off with my argument. Let me see if I've got a sort of list here, so I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try and give you a presentation about some of the pleasures of power. We'll have some discussions and questions. And then an opportunity, I hope, to pick up some criticisms with what I'm saying, because I think there are some very different ways to approach the questions about the pleasures that people have from power. And I just would like to acknowledge that before we finish. So clearly the question of who's most powerful is a very popular one. This was published, I think, just today in the Indian Express. I certainly just picked it up. The idea of there being some people who have a lot of power, who exert power, really is the background to most formal studies of power in organizational life. And that is usually analyzed in terms of the kinds of levers that people have. What does their power rest in? Is it their control of resources, of symbolic power, of language? Is it control of ideology or of institutions? And all of those are very useful and important perspectives on power. But I do want to take something a little bit different. So I want to invite you today, as we go through this talk, to think about your own experience of being powerful, where you feel you've had some power, and what you enjoy about it. What's the pleasure that you have in it? And if you could just, while I'm talking, be thinking about that, maybe making some notes for yourself to bring back to the discussion. And let's think, it's not only about leadership that we need to understand is really impossible without power. There can't really be any organized action without power. And this is from a paper about social movements and activism. So outside of formal organizations, with people try to get organized to do things, to make, in this case, protests about the climate crisis, they really have to come to terms with power and their own pleasures and their fears about power. And a lot of people do get anxious. I think most of us get anxious when we're faced with people whose grasp on power or whose passion for power seems uncontrollable. And another great scholar of organizations have said power is to organization as oxygen is to breathing. We can't really think about organizing without exerting, controlling, directing power. This is really what organizing requires powering, let's say. But the argument that I'm making, that we should look at how one feels about power, how you feel about having it, is not universally accepted. And this is quite an influential article and a great author on negotiation, and which of course is essential in any kind of real activation of power, is that he's saying that really your feelings of power, how powerful you feel, can lead you astray in negotiation. You really need to think objectively about what are your interests and what can you offer and what are the interests of your counterparties in any kind of negotiation. And if you see organizations as made up of a lot of micro negotiations, you might say, well, your own feelings are irrelevant. The question is, what's your real position in this? But I really think that this may be true in a kind of analytic sense, but the feeling, the pleasure, the energy for organizing, for getting things done, really is a subjective, visceral thing. It is to do with how you feel. And Napoleon Bonaparte, perhaps the greatest exponent of European history of power, wrote this a wonderful letter to his friend, in which he said, "My mistress is power. and I couldn't bear anyone to take from me. And I think this expresses something of the closeness, the rich, almost the whole body experience of feeling powerful. And anybody who like me, enjoys competitive sports, I enjoy competitive sailing, will know that the feeling in your whole body when you're competing and when you're feeling on form, when you're in the flow and you're doing well, is a wonderful feeling, and it is much to do with power. And that sense in organizing, in getting things done, in whether it's competing in a competitive capitalist enterprise, or whether you're in a public service and you're trying to get things done for other people, the sense of your own competence and ability is tremendously energizing. So this is what I really want to focus on in this talk. And a summary is going to be something like this. That I will say that there are, broadly speaking, three kinds of pleasures, and I'm going to say more about each of these. And that some of these pleasures are to do with identity, some to do with influence, and some to do with interaction. And that, broadly speaking, as one grows older and as one becomes more senior in an organization or in a field of specialism, the kinds of pleasures that you might find available to you and relevant to you, the things you want, the pleasures you want to enjoy, shift over time. In an early career, they're mainly around identity, then they become around influence, and then they become around interaction. Now, there are important exceptions to this, which I will talk about, but let me just lay out this thesis first of all. So broadly speaking, when we represent power relations, it's often done in something like this in an organization. This is a diagram from a PwC handbook on change management. And you can see here the general assumptions around power are that it's mainly top down, that people lower down in an organizational hierarchy have some opportunity to resist change or to come up with ideas and give voice, but mainly speaking, it's a top down sort of thing. And that the sorts of pleasures that are available to people in each of those levels must be quite different. And maybe some of them don't get much pleasure at all from the exercise of power. And we can see this same dynamic represented in a less idealized form here, perhaps more experientially, in this picture by the street artist Filthy Luca. And he shows here in this picture something of the experience of the world being constantly shifted and changed, the rules changing, reorganizations and refocus strategies, and that people who are trying to do their work and do their job are constantly also having to adapt to this. So the question is all the pleasure for power really with that invisible hand at the top, the person who's shifting things around, or are there pleasures to be found throughout, even in this kind of context? And broadly speaking, I think that thinking about our power and talking about it with each other, trying to understand what is available to us to enjoy and to work with, to be creative with, to become competent with, empowering, is something that's open to us and made much easier if we have conversations with each other directly about it. So that's what I'm hoping that we'll have today. We'll have some conversations about what are our pleasures, where do we find the enjoyment in powering, and some of these are sort of easy to talk about and on the surface, and some of these are perhaps a bit more unconscious or maybe even subversive. But it really helps to be open and honest about these, I think. But it's also true, we must recognize that for some people, many people in the contemporary world, power is experienced as something just overwhelmingly bad and destructive. Power is something that's done to me. I have no power in this world. But what I want to do through this talk is to help, if anybody is feeling like this, you're going to get up from underneath those yellow lines and find something to find some joy in powering. But it is, when we talk about power, it is sometimes a kind of dirty word. And if someone says, I like power, I enjoy power, that sometimes seems to be perhaps not quite acceptable, slightly perverse. And we do often talk about it as if power is something to be embarrassed about. And there's no doubt that for many people in the world, there's an experience now that the world is running away with us, that globalization is getting away from us, and therefore we turn to more local populist leaders to lead us, or that climate change is driving the most dreadful and unstoppable, out of control series of crises in front of which all we can do is run or barricade ourselves into our more protected and privileged spaces if we can. And in the face of these experiences of powerlessness and out of control change, one might say, well, what pleasure you have in power is kind of irrelevant. But I hope that by the end of the next 15, 20 minutes or so, you'll begin to see that it's not quite like that. There's actually more that we can draw out, and more nuance in this relationships with power. So I'm going to talk firstly briefly about the pleasures of power associated with identity. And this is a picture I found by Adriana Cernin, where she's made use of the geometric shapes in some Islamic architecture to paint a person kind of almost camouflaged within the order and structure of these shapes. And I think this matches certainly my experience and the experience of many of my interviewees in this research project of joining an organization, of starting out in life in a new company, a new industry, a new sector, and finding that there are structures, there are patterns, there are ways things are done, there's language that's used, there are certain habits and practices that you have to learn and try to fit in. And in that fitting in to it, it comes, well, the right to be there, to be part of it, but also the risk of kind of disappearing into the into the structure. But if one's not able to adopt and fit in some way into these structures, it's really hard to get going in a career and in life, or any specialism or any discipline. And in this picture, I think we see this woman very thoughtfully wondering, can I emerge as myself? How much of myself can I reveal in here, or should I keep covered up, as it were? And this is, of course, early in a career, a very important concern. And if she really can't find the confidence to come out of this, she's going to be hidden within the structure. So she needs to find for herself some pleasure in the power of standing out. But she can't stand out too much because she won't fit in anymore. So she's got to do things within this structure that enable her to feel a sense of herself within it. So one of the important pleasures of identity is about being able to feel oneself within a context. And just a couple more pictures by the same artist here, which show the same sort of idea. And in the lower left-hand corner, and I think in both of these pictures, you see a bit more movement in the picture. You have a sense that, oh, she's beginning to find her way around inside these structures. And just quite by chance, at the same exhibition where I saw that first picture, there was this patterned mirror on the wall. So I took a photograph of myself kind of fitting within that structure. And I wanted to show you that because I think it made me think a lot about how I managed as an academic for 30 years, trying to find a balance of both speaking my own voice, being an original contributor in my field, teaching my students in my own way, working with my colleagues, but also fitting into the structure and learning the disciplines of academic study and writing, of teaching or playing my part in organizational processes. And as I did that, particularly early on in my career, I got a great sense of this is who I am. Here I am, an academic, Jonathan Gosling, an academic within these structures. And this gave me a great sense of satisfaction. And I had available to me, I was able to enjoy the pleasures of identity in fitting myself into these structures. And it affirmed me the more I was successful at this. Sometimes it threatened and constrained me. Sometimes I fought and rebelled against the structures and found a new way into it. And I think it's an important capacity to have, to be able to direct the pleasures of identity, in ways that fit in, but also, of course, don't make you disappear. And in this picture, you can see someone. Now, this speaks to me of that more sort of private time at the beginnings of the morning before going to work, where you're kind of changing from your domestic family identity and self and clothes into putting on your work. Just a few minutes before we started this video, I took off my sweatshirt and went and put on a shirt with a collar. So I thought this is appropriate, So I was a little bit like this woman in this picture. Just a few moments ago, I was had my shirt off in front of the mirror, thinking, okay, how do I get myself ready for giving this talk or in this way? And I continue to enjoy the challenge of taking on this identity and of enacting it, I hope, properly. And so the pleasure, one of the important aspects of the pleasures of identity, I think, is this sense of self-discipline, of being able to say, I'm going to craft myself into an identity that is appropriate for the public and for the relationships I'm engaging in. And to find that an interesting thing to do is something which is, I think, necessary for those of us who want to engage and have influence and be out there, not to be, as it were, pushed aside. So I made a kind of list here, what I think are the pleasures of the power of identity, the identity-related pleasures. And one of them is about, it affirms and modifies one's own self-image. I came to see myself as no longer a student, but gradually to see myself as a lecturer and a professor over time. So, and gain pleasure in that. And I'm sure others here will have similar experiences in your own fields. And as I said, the disciplines of the self, the sense of I can manage myself, I can control myself, I hope appropriately for the circumstances. Another aspect of the pleasure identity is to know that one has impact. And that, for me, in my life, has mainly come from teaching, when occasionally a student says, thank you, Professor, that's really helped me with my thinking or my learning. And that it's nice for them, but it sort of feeds me. It gives me a sense of, oh, I did all that getting things together and it's had an impact. That makes me feel like I'm somebody who exists and connects with people in the world. Also, of course, pleasures about getting ahead in whatever kind of career structure you're in, and being respected by others. There's also a sensual satisfaction, a sort of inner satisfaction of think, oh, I think I know who I am. So it lasts only for a moment, that sense of knowledge, but there it is. And then the various reified qualities of the self that come as you engage with these pleasures. But there are, of course, risks, particularly that this concern with sort of proving oneself in the world becomes so dominant that you can't really be creative and you can't make real connections with other people because you're so concerned about yourself, you're not available to meet with them and be interested in them. And so this picture by Jiro Osoga, I think, represents something like that. I think, it feels like here he is, all he sees in the crowd is images of himself because he's become so concerned with that. And actually the artist wrote a little piece about this painting, which says pretty much that. It is a self-portrait. These pleasures of identity, last for so long and cover so much of activity. But a lot of people I've interviewed, and I hope you'll recognise this, and I've find it myself, that after a certain time, I don't really mind about whether I'm recognised. I just want to have some influence and get some things done. And for some people, I think that they come to this much earlier in their life and career than others. And the pleasures of having an influence on the world are quite a little bit more sort of complex. And I've chosen this picture by Jutta Koerter here, where you can see she's involved. This sort of figure of the self is sort of dissolved into the context, into the situation, all the things that need doing. And I think it's a very beautiful picture. And I think it's it's partly, I think, about organizing, managing her own internal world. But I think it's really all the projects and relationships that she's involved with in this picture are represented here as places where she has some presence and some influence, but she doesn't need to be central to any of them. And I think any of us who've thought, we really need to move forward on a particular agenda, for example, on an agenda of gender equality, we need to do something about this. Well, I'm not going to be a leader in gender equality, but I might be able to help some parts of shifting that agenda forward. I might be able to do a little bit. I can have some influence, and that sense of it being really enjoyable to be part with other people, to join with other people and try to make some things happen. And the relationships I have, I don't necessarily need to like them, or they don't need to like me, but we have something in common we're trying to do. And that is itself a very different kind of pleasure to the one of identity. It's about an object that's out there. It's not all about inside me and my image of myself. It's about being able to really create something out there and play a part in doing that with others. And you can see that I've gone back to my list of powerful people, and here this is powerful women, self-made women in India. Now, maybe some of these are really caught up with identity and questions of identity, but the research I've done shows that very often women find much more accessible these pleasures of influence, let's say, in getting things forward. And I'd be really interested to hear from people in the next section if that's really matches your experience. And these couple of pictures are about the Ebola crisis in 2014, 2015, which were remarkable and successful attempts to control a very deadly pandemic and disease, mainly in West Africa, where it's really difficult, if you look at this case, to find any particular leader. I don't think there was any one person who led the fight against Ebola. There were a lot of people from a lot of different countries, including India, who played a very important part in the research and in the response and in really organizing in the logistics, in the politics, and around fighting the Ebola outbreaks. The first outbreak, of course, spread wildly before people got hold of it. The second major outbreak was really closed down and cleared up within 16 days through the sort of the learned ability of people to work together and have an influence on this. And the people I've spoken to who are part of it still speak now with the tremendous pleasure of having an influence on something that they did. They talk also about the relationships they had, but this sense of pleasure and influence in making something happen. And I'm sure that goes in all fields. Now, I want to talk briefly about the third area I outlined, which are called pleasures from interaction with others. Now, broadly speaking, what I'm going to talk about here is the sense that at a certain time in one's career, I guess one is less involved in influencing and running specific projects because people are involved in sort of policy overall, and in policy the specific projects become less of a focus and more it's about the ideas and the connections, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. I think the sense of being involved in power relationships can start does start quite early in life, and this is an extraordinary artwork, a performance artwork by Marina Abramovich and her partner Ulay, which is you can look it up on the internet. It's a 4-minute video, and they stand like this, holding this bow and arrow, and they shuffle round and turn round in a circle. And as you can see, they are completely interdependent. If any one of them lets go, the other will fall down. But the consequences of their interdependence are not equal. Because if he lets go, the arrow will go into her heart. And you might wonder, why would anyone voluntarily go into this kind of relationship? And I think it speaks to something of the capacity for risk, for danger, even a kind of self-abnegation. I don't want to say, it's not sadism and masochism, because I don't think it's about purposefully doing pain to oneself or each other, but it's certainly about risk, about domination and subordination. And to be able to find some degree of pleasure in obedience, in dependency, in subordination, is definitely helpful in any kind of hierarchy, because broadly speaking, most people are subordinate in some ways and have to be obedient in many ways. And to find the pleasure in that is a great help in being able to get along in any kind of hierarchy. But we don't often talk about this, about the pleasures of domination and submission. But I do think that they are very significant parts of the interactive element of powering in most kinds of organization. It doesn't need to lead to cruelty, but it helps us watch and notice the inequalities of power. So sometimes, I might say that this picture represents the annual performance appraisal, in which both people take part, the manager and the managed, but the consequences are unequal. And it's very important and makes a big difference if it's done really well and done safely. But to go into those kind of situations with any sort of excitement or energy does require to have some pleasure in this sort of unequal power relations. And of course, there are lots of people who love mixing with the powerful. And this rather wonderful photograph from a little while back is, I'm sure, recognizable to you all. And you're the president of India, Mr. Modi, is, I know, somebody who really enjoys his role. There are lots of wonderful pictures we can get of this. And I think most people who are in that kind of very senior power position, also in corporations, are in a situation where you don't have direct control. It's not sort of hands-on, minute-by-minute operational control of things, but you're mixing with a world in which the balance of power is being constantly renegotiated, and to have to enjoy that and to get caught up in it is something that is an opportunity that's open to not all of us, but I think that you have to really enjoy that if you're going to be in those very senior roles. And so my kind of final picture in laying out these types of power, types of pleasure, is this picture of Napoleon again. I've returned to where I started, and at his coronation, and you see he's actually crowning here his wife. And one of the lovely things about this picture is it's so complicated and so full of fake news that it's very sort of contemporary in that way, that you can see behind him is the Pope, who he had held prisoner and brought here really under chains to force him to sanctify. So he needed the sort of, as it were, the sanctification from the representative of God to make him emperor, and now he's crowning his wife. And various other characters here are all very interesting military, including some rather suspect conspiracy theorists and so on. But in the back you can see a woman sitting there in the green box on her own, with some other family members around her, and this is Napoleon's mother. And he was very keen that his mother should witness him. So for him, the pleasure of identity remained so strong. He wanted his mum to see that he was the emperor. The point is, she didn't come. She wasn't there. This was painted in. He required the artist to paint in his mother's presence because he so wanted her to have been there. But she refused. She said, "This is ridiculous. I'm not coming all the way to Paris to see this crazy show. You're getting ahead of yourself." And wasn't going to participate in that. So we can see the pleasures associated with power are complex. They're definitely psychological, and they're available. I'm going to give you now one brief slide. This is rather too neat, but I think that it might help in thinking about how these three pleasures sort of line up. So we've got, broadly speaking, here along the top, pleasures of identity, influence, and interaction. And the focus of pleasures of identity is self. The focus of pleasures of influence is other, is making something happen out there. And the pleasure of interaction is around relationships and being related with each other and connected in relation. And broadly speaking, I said these go in career stages, early, mid, and later. Now, if you wanted to look at these by personality type, I've taken here Freud's three main types, personality type: the narcissist, the obsessive, and the dependent, or he called the dependent and the erotic. That's the person who's constantly ought to be getting excitement and feedback from others to know themselves. And the narcissist is, of course, self-absorbed. And the obsessive are caught up with controlling the world out there. Now, some of the risks associated with each of these types becoming too extreme is if one is thwarted in one's attempts at identity work, you have a sense of personal failure. Not only my project has failed, not have I failed at doing something, but I am a failure. I've often had to say to my students, if I grade a paper that is not quite at the pass mark, I need to say, look, it's not that you are not a failure. It's just the argument you presented in this paper doesn't quite meet the mark. But you are not a failure. And to make that distinction between self and other, is very important. And it's difficult if you're caught up with entity, with pleasure of identity. When you really heavily invested in influence, you may fail. And certainly many of the projects and agendas that I've pursued and care about, I've failed at, and I've had to cope with, in that sense, defeat and a sense of loss of the whole venture that I was invested in. And similarly, with pleasures of interaction, if you don't fit in, if you're no longer wanted, if you no longer have what it takes, you can just be exiled, and you can see people who just lose it when they're no longer part of the mix. And when these pleasures become perversely expressed, you see it in personality cults and status. So we can see this in some very prominent leaders these days, where it's all about them. President Trump said, I could walk down the street and I could shoot somebody on Main Street and I wouldn't lose any votes. And he's probably right, because the cult around him is so strong. But I think it's probably damaging for the world at large when these personality cults become overarching. The perverse expressions of influence are around control freakery and the desire to control everything, and then perverse expressions of the pleasures of interaction are around kind of neurotic networking, having to be engaged with everything and constantly trying to politically gain one thing and another, losing a sense of purpose. What's this really for? Being disconnected with a sense of higher purpose. So I've laid out my thesis. I hope we'll have time to address your thoughts and comments about this. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Jonathan, very, very interesting and very well summarized as well. So with a lot of visuals. And so if I may start, very interestingly, you lay out the three pleasures: identity, influence, and interaction. And you say there is a kind of a hierarchy there, in the sense that you have identity and then you move on to influence and then there's interaction. So does that also mean that these pleasures are nested within each other, in the sense that if I have to interact with someone, or if I am talking about the pleasure of interaction, then I have to essentially also be thinking about pleasure of identity as well as influence. Only then I can talk about or think about pleasure uh, of interaction. Because how would I get into a relationship or manage a relationship if I am not sure of my own self, and if I am not able to find my place uh, amongst others? Then how do I talk about it? So are they nested also within each other?
I think I think not necessarily. I think that it's that some people.
I would feel nested perhaps would mean, are they arranged in a kind of a pyramid thing, that as you move to interaction, you would have actually satisfied your pleasures of identity and influence. Would that be the case?
Yes, I think that's why I try to link these to personality types, because I think that there are some people who have a more of a tendency towards being what one might call a dependent or erotic personality types, whose whole way of being is much more around being part of, connected with others, and are from an early age less anxious about their ego and selfhood, so less around identity, and perhaps people for whom this kind of personality type are more likely to be from an early age sort of networking rather than trying to achieve specific goals and things. They want to be part of something. And you can see some entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs who, and also politically minded people, some who from quite an early stage really gain their place in the world and the maximum of their pleasures from these interactions. However, when you look in the political sphere, you really can see that putting one's personality forward, the pleasures, as it were, of identity, really remains very important. But my guess is that there are some people in, for example, the world of investment banking and venture capital, for whom being kind of part of new ideas and new technology, new concepts, new realities, is always, even from an early age, an early stage in their career, something that they're really engaged with. And they don't have to be the main person. They don't have to be up front all the time. They just want to be in the mix where things are happening. It's that kind of swimming in powering, as it were.
Yeah. So my thought, or my reaction to the thought was, because when I'm talking about powering as the verb that you used, and a very, very nice verb to actually think about, powering. When I'm powering and I'm thinking about my interactions, can I be an individual who is not sure of myself but still be good at interactions and creating that kind of relief? So do you think that that kind of situation does exist, when my pleasure of or my identity is not sorted out, but I'm still willing to work or working towards those interactions and relationships?
Yeah, I think that those three sort of Freudian types, the narcissist, the obsessive, and the dependent or erotic, are really about, can be thought of as ways of defending ego defenses, because the sense of selfhood, it needs defending, and later psychoanalysts like Lacan talk about this sort of lack, the sense of emptiness or of lack in our being, And this gets filled in different ways or defended against in different ways. And for some, to have that sense of identity before making a move of any kind is really important. But there are some people, I think, for whom that ego is defended not by strengthening the self, but by strengthening the connections and the belonging. It's a different strategy. So,
so the other question, Jonathan, on this was, you talk about these three pleasures. Do you think there is any connection with the type of career choices people make and these pleasures? So, are these pleasures more amenable to certain kinds of professions or careers? What would be your take on that?
I think I don't have the data to give a proper answer to that question. So well, I can give you my prejudice to it. And my sense is that the pleasures of influence, if I start with that in the middle, really suit people who are project managers, who want to initiate and maintain progress on certain activities, on running things and managing them, getting them done, and really like to have an operational hold on things, so there's a control thing. So the kinds of work where operational control is possible is going to give more pleasure for them. The kinds of jobs where it's just too complex. So if we take a field of healthcare, for example, we can see people who want to be a specialist in a particular kind of clinical field, might really enjoy the pleasures of influence, because they can have a feel, they can cure people, or they can run a department or research project or a whole health facilities. But people who are thinking about how do we think about health in relation to housing and social care, elderly people, and mental health and pandemics and all that complexity, where you can't really get any pleasure from getting control of it because it's too big and complex. That kind of health-related job is going to be difficult for somebody whose main pleasure comes from influence.
Okay, so just a follow-up question on this. Would you then recommend, Jonathan, giving the kind of business environment we see around us, given the kind of complexities we see in terms of technologies, in terms of the new age work that we are seeing, would you think that for an individual, for a leader or a manager to be effective and successful in these days, they need to have all kinds of pleasures, or they need to enjoy all kinds of pleasures and not get limited to one? So in the sense that you need to be sure of your identity, you need to be sure of the contributions you are making, and then you need to be sure of the relationships and the kind of networks you have around. What would be your thought on that? Yeah.
Yes, I think you don't need to be sure of them, but you need to enjoy the work in becoming more sure of them. So you need to find a bit like the pleasure. Well, the pleasure I find in racing my boats is I'm not sure I'm going to win, but I really like trying. And the pleasure of
there would be pleasure of trying out of the three.
Yeah. And I think the pleasure of trying and pleasure around identity is in crafting a sense of oneself in the context of things you're trying to do, and the pleasure of trying and influence is a pleasure in trying to influence the world, trying to get things to happen, and the pleasures of trying and empowering in the interactive sphere is really about setting an agenda, getting the discourse going in the direction you want. Like a lot of us are involved now in trying to think about responsible leadership and responsible business, and trying to get that on the agenda. There's no one person going to be the representative, but bit by bit over the years, we more and more we're thinking, you know, business has a really important part to play in what it is to be human, to be an inhabitant of the planet, and it's, yes, profit's really, really important, but there's more that one can think about in terms of responsibility, and this discourse is shifting and changing. And certainly I get a great deal of pleasure from being part of the worldwide community of people who are thinking and talking about these things. And it's not about my ideas being prominent. It's about just a sense that I'm in tune with the way things are going. Okay.
So there are some very interesting questions, and many from the audience are writing to us. So I'll take the first question, Jonathan, for you. So Rakesh says, would you say taking pleasure in power is a positive orientation for one to have? At what point does one's pursuit for power become negative or Machiavellian? So I think that's a question you will get from Indian audience a lot. So at what point, and very interestingly, you showed President Putin's image as well, where does it become negative and destructive?
Yeah. So Rajesh, thanks for the question. It is of course a really important question, and I think that the destructiveness becomes evident in two ways. The first is for oneself, that if you're really stuck in pursuing the pleasures of power associated with identity, you'll never move beyond constantly seeking reinforcement for yourself. And we can see how this becomes really significant for many political leaders, that they go out there, particularly in democracies, because they get voted for, they get likes, and they want more likes, and they want to be liked, and they want people to recognize them, to be known, and to be on top of all the billboards and the newspapers. And that sense is reinforcing what they're doing, and that becomes, you know, definitely problematic if they're not able to then get down and concentrate on having some influence, making things happen, fulfilling their promises. And so I think it's negative for them, and it's negative for the rest of us if they become overpowering. And as I explained in my in that little diagram I showed, that the sort of perverse pleasures that can kind of overtake. So pleasures of identity, which are normal and proper and necessary in good measure, when they become extreme and perverse, lead to, as I say, personality cults and an obsession with status. And pleasures of influence, likewise, you just really want to control everything. And you know, some of the protests around the increasing government control through the COVID, and the desire for some governments to have total surveillance, total control, what as we're seeing in China now, you know, is experienced by some people as perhaps you know, an extreme overdose of the pleasures of influence, and where it's just total surveillance and control. And I don't think that's good for society. It's not good for creativity. It's not good for life when they become perverse.
So that also takes us to the second question by Mubarak, and he says, what would be, again from your experience, how should a leader balance these poles, in the sense that you have these pleasures, and then the pleasures may go take you to the other side, the perverse pleasures. What would be your recommendation to balance this out and ensure that this does not kind of happen?
Yeah, well, I think that some of the, as it were, the virtues of each of these pleasures need to be emphasized. And I think we should, they exist in all religious and cultural traditions, and we should be definitely reinforcing them in universities and business schools. But I think, for example, one of the virtues associated with identity and the pleasure of identity is that of humility, because when one becomes, as you sort of craft your sense of identity more and become more alert to who I am, if this is done with greater and greater finesse and wisdom, it actually produces not more and more pride, but more and more humility in those ways. And similarly, around influence, pleasures of influence in the world, it may start off with saying, oh, I can make things happen. After a while, you may think, well, yeah, I can help a lot of things to happen, but what really is good about those things? What is the good? So I think there's a sort of virtue of justice that is associated with the pleasures of influence. And so, and to just finish off the three, I think the great virtue associated with it, the pleasures of interaction, it is one of compassion, of a sense that we have an all-inclusive concern and love, and it's through compassion and for the purpose, for compassionate purposes, that what I can begin to engage in these pleasures. So the pleasures are no longer for their own sake. The pleasure of identity is not just to make me, but to craft a really fine version of me, and so on. So that's through humility, justice, and compassion.
So I think what you're mentioning, Jonathan, here is very interesting. You say, well, there are these pleasures, and what our education system should perhaps do is to also promote these virtues of humility, justice, and compassion, to ensure that the perverse incentives of pleasures do not overtake or kind of supersede. Very interesting thought. So there's another interesting question that Ashutosh asked, and he says, what should one do at work to manage situations after understanding this thesis? So well, I have to go back to my organization, and well, I will again have to go back to work. And how do I apply these ideas at work? Jonathan, what would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think, and I hope you'll find it helpful in your own self-assessment of the situations you're in. I must say, I came to this whole thesis when I was asked by a colleague. I told a colleague I was very pleased. I'd been invited to take on the chairmanship of quite a significant entity, and I was very pleased with myself and thought that was great. And I rather proudly said to a colleague, I've been asked to do this, and I think I'm going. Aren't I great? And he said to me, well, why do you want to do that? And I thought, well, because I can, because they've asked me, because I might. Well, hold on, why do I want to do this? What is the kind of pleasure that I expect to have from this? And asking myself that question was really helpful to me in making the decision. And so I began to talk to more and more other people and ask them these questions, well, just the question that you've asked now. So I think it's helpful for oneself. And it's definitely, if you feel that, well, in that case, I felt that it was too much for me about identity. And I thought, actually, I've been here before. I've gone for jobs and roles and positions that have flattered my ego, and realized that I don't really need that now. Actually, I've done it. I think I still need it. My first reaction is to reach for that pleasure, but actually, it's a bit tired now. And similarly around influence, the sense that I've run a lot of things. I've influenced a lot of things. I've done a lot of things. And still someone says to me, Jonathan, would you take this on? Would you take a seat on this board? Would you do something else? And my first reaction is, yes, I could do something. But then I remember, it's going to be another one of those projects that I've got to manage. And I've got a lot of those. Maybe I need to put a bit more effort into thinking through how I can enjoy pleasures of interaction at this stage in my life and career.
So very interesting. I think that's a great thought. Why should I do things, and how does it maybe massage my ego, and do I need it? And as in, what's the kind of influence and what's the kind of work? So again, very useful pointers there. There's one question by Marisa, and she says, how do you explain the pleasures associated with the dark side of our personality? So again, so question on the dark side, and in extreme cases, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and some kind of psychopathy. And what then do you think is the journey to being more humanistic and have faith in others? So again, it's how do you navigate? So I think you did answer, but anything you want to add on to that, Jonathan?
Yeah. Well, I think I think the question of the dark side is really, really interesting, because you might say that the pleasures of influence might include the pleasure to find pleasure in Machiavellian maneuvering and manipulating agendas. And certainly I can think of my own life in universities and so on, where having an influence on decisions that are made, giving money to one department rather than another, and all those things, required quite a bit of backroom politics and keeping things, as it were, playing the committee system and working with it. And I'm sure any of us who worked in institutions know that that's important. And if you find that really crucifies your soul and just dreadful to be rolled in, you're not going to find much pleasure in it, and you won't stick at it. So the capacity to, as it were, give some free rein to those dark side pleasures is, I think, necessary to take on organizational roles. Just as the capacity for some narcissism, I always thought it was important that narcissism in its less extreme form is a sense that in your mind you can see how things should be. I know. So if you're working with a team, you say, I know how this team can work. And you say, this is how it is. This could be great. And you hold that anyway. And even though other people have different ideas, different views, you kind of overpower them with your sense of this is the reality in my mind is the real reality. What's actually happening between us is just because we're falling flat a bit. And that is the power of a narcissistic sort of vision and commitment to one's own sort of self-image of the world. And I think so I think mobilizing, it's just a fine line. It's a fine line. It's not even a fine line. It sort of goes from from sort of phase of different sort of gray into it before it becomes really dark. And I think that's how we have to think about it.
So I always wonder this, and as in when I do some trainings on leadership, many people ask me, are there any early signals, Jonathan, that we are headed, or maybe we've crossed the fine line? Are there any signals that one could look out for? We do know, and research does tell us today, that dark side and these traits have some purposes also, like you very rightly mentioned. Setting a vision, driving an agenda needs certain kinds of traits, and narcissism is not always bad. Machiavellianism is not always, may not always be destructive. But are there any early signals for individuals or organizations to maybe think about when you're thinking about these pleasures, that I enjoy these things, but I need to maybe think about these signals too.
Yeah. I think that I hinted at some of these. For example, for example, in the dominant subordinate interaction I described by showing that clip from Maria Abramovich's video, if you find yourself enjoying the bullying at someone else, that's a sign. If you find yourself constantly subjecting yourself, as it were, and over and again getting into those kinds of relationships where the other party is really letting go the arrows, that's a sign that those dark sides are becoming too much. In other words, if the pleasure becomes destructive and not creative, and it's not always easy to see up front, but I think with a degree of self reflection, it's why really self-knowledge and reflectiveness is a very important sort of practice for leading and leadership. And also that picture I showed right at the beginning of the people sitting around talking honestly with each other. I think you need friends. You need friends who you can talk to about these things, and try to keep a balance on it. I don't think it is a sort of automatic signal. Maybe there will be an artificial intelligence that can spot the weak signals of out of control pleasures. But I think in the meantime, thoughtful, reflective, considered judgment with people who have your best interests at heart is the best recourse.
There's an interesting question by Margaret, and she asks, have you thought of these pleasures from a follower perspective? And how do these pleasures, so she says, from a follower perspective, impacting leader effectiveness. So how do followers look at these pleasures and their possible reactions to these ideas?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. I presume, Margaret, you mean you're looking at a leader who just wants to control things all the time, gets all their kicks from being in control, and what do you do about it? And they seem to be having a lovely time and enjoying themselves. Everyone else is screwed down under their thumb, and but I think it helps to be able to think through. Okay, that's where that person's pleasures are. Then you have to really think for yourself, how am I able to find room for my pleasures in this? And also, if you have the sort of scope and ability to think how one might raise that as a possibility to others. I remember a colleague at work once referring to me. He just asked the question, about, so you're finding so much pleasure in playing the politics, Jonathan, at work, and it just got me thinking that, oh, that's what I'm doing here. A well-placed question can sometimes be effective. Yeah.
Or a well-placed question, or as a follower, you may even need to learn to identify the pleasures early and then maybe navigate the relationship with your boss and supervisor intelligently, understanding that these are the pleasures that they or he or she enjoys, and therefore I need to maybe work with this individual a little differently. So that may be a smart thing to think about. So there's this question from Jevelu, and he says, how would these insights be used for leadership development, as in at school level, at MBA level, for graduates, and what would be your recommendation on what can be done around leadership development?
Well, I think that a lot of leadership development, certainly in my experience, is around, really majors on the questions of identity, on the individual development, the sense of boosting the confidence and the capability of people to bring them to create for themselves a leader identity. I am a leader. You see so much leaders of tomorrow, leaders of today, and I think a lot of leadership development is really oriented at maybe massaging, or at least sort of winding up the pleasures of identity. I think we could do much more around leadership development, which is influence oriented, and I'd like to see more leadership development which is focused around improving things. How do we collectively enjoy our capacity to influence, and in so doing improve the quality of work or the practices they're engaged in? So for example, I'm involved now with doing quite a bit of work in healthcare, at frontline operational healthcare, because big global strategies around malaria and HIV and things, work for the mass, but it's always the last mile. It's the difficult to reach populations. It's areas that are facing constant, climate change and so on, where it needs just a lot of local knowledge, local initiative, local adaptation, and the sort of work we're doing there is helping groups of people collectively, communities and frontline health services, to take a sense of authority, to have influence on that. And for some people, it's about finding their voice, finding a sense of identity in doing this, in having an effect. But overall, that kind of leadership development is about leadership of the services, of the health services, rather than boosting the leader. So it's an influence-oriented leadership development rather than an identity influence. And then, of course, the interaction kind of leadership development happens a lot places like Davos, the World Economic Forum, and I know there are many that happen. The Institute of Directors in India runs a number of programs. We're pulling together key leaders particularly in business, to network and influence and share the influence with each other. And those are places where already that kind of interaction-oriented leadership development is happening. So if you are organizing leadership development within a company or in a sector or in an executive institute, you might want to consciously think, which kinds of pleasures are we really playing to here? And that's associated with, what do we want to try to achieve? Who do we want to attract? What do we want to mobilize in people? And if you have people who are very identity oriented, and they're used and habituated to the pleasures of identity, and you want to engage them in influence, you can then chart out a path about how to make that possible for them.
So there's a question from Piyush, and he says, we pursue power, pleasure, and profit. We want as much as we get, as much as we can get, and we deploy instrumental reasoning, cost-benefit analysis to get it. We judge ourselves and others by how well we succeed. It is a way of life and thought, and seems natural, inevitable, and inescapable. What is your view for a leader? Because we do all of this and we are judged by others. And Piyush, you want to add on to anything? The question, or is that enough?
That's enough.
Jonathan?
So, yeah. Well, life is not all about pleasure, and we can't realistically organize every moment of our lives around the kinds of things that give us pleasure. But we need an amount of it. We need some of it. And I think also we're quite adept at sort of sublimating pleasures for symbols that stand for them. So so when for example, as an academic, I know that I published some papers, and I don't really know what influence they're having in the world out there. But I have things that stand in for that. There are best paper awards or citations, or sometimes just an email from somebody saying thank you so much for that idea. It sort of stands in for those pleasures. And when it comes to questions around driving for well, profit is not only of course it's pleasurable to succeed in any kind of competition, but profit is necessary for like sort of organizational life and breathing and rejuvenation and so on, and sustaining. But if you get to feeling I'm just being driven by the profit and I'm not finding any pleasure in this sense of adding value, and that added value being recognized by customers who are prepared to pay for it, if that pleasure is no longer there, it's just a matter of meeting the numbers, then it's probably time to move on, because life is too short.
There are many organizations where, as we see, as organizations grow big, it is difficult for them to sustain, and many organizations kind of break up or fall by the wayside. So there is a question by Jhalak, and she says, how do you keep, as a leader, and maybe based on this thesis, what can we do as leaders to prevent these institutions breaking up or dampening the inspiration that they had initially, and sustain the good work that they had been doing? And so how does one maybe continue the good work that is happening in these institutions or organizations?
Well, that's a big question, and it probably has more to do with it has to do with more than powering, and the sense of sustained purpose and drive, ambition, and enthusiasm. I think some of that is down to leadership and down to the kinds of pleasures that are available to people in those organizations. And I have seen some, for example, social enterprises that have been set up with great vigor and become really quite effective and impressive. But then they become too small a pond for the founders who need to move on to somewhere else. And because their sense of ambition and their desire for a wider, more interactive sphere becomes perhaps overreaches what the organization can manage, it's a strain on everybody else. So I think overall there are a lot of different ways to tackle that question, but I think one of them is to have really good governance, and I think to have some whether you have a formal structure of a non-executive directors and a board, or you have informal but committed non-executive advisors, people who can help you think through the kind of trouble you're in and the kind of opportunities you're facing, is very, very helpful in sustaining the energy and the capacity to adapt and change.
What would be the relationship between power you talked about, and we had a big discussion on pleasures of power, and politics? How would they be related? And are they the same, or they are exhibited differently? They are seen differently?
Well, it's interesting. I think obviously power and politics are very closely related to each other, and quite a bit of organizational life is necessarily political, particularly in large corporations, where you inevitably have plurality of interests, different interest groups who want to achieve different things, who have different priorities, who see things differently. And those different perspectives and different interests have to be balanced, and sometimes that seems like playing one off against another and so on. So these are, as it were, organizational politics. And if you don't have an appetite for organizational politics, then an organization is the wrong place for you to be, because that's what goes on, especially at more senior levels. And really the job of the very senior executives is really to do the politics, is to work out the balance of power and influence and privileges as they go, and resources. So I think it's wrong to talk about politics as necessarily something bad or wrong in organizational. But that's not to say that if politics become an end in themselves, if winning a political battle becomes the sole purpose of something, then that gets very destructive and soul destroying for everybody else. In politics more broadly, in sort of public life, clearly a lot of it is about gaining and maintaining and using power. And there are a lot of different tactics available to people in that. And I think that we can shift from our focus on the pleasures of power into some look at, well, what are the kinds of tactics of power that are available to people, and particularly to people who have different, who have a tendency to enjoy different pleasures. So, for example, so tactics around manipulation and maneuvering is really open to people who love, who get pleasure from influence and pleasure from interaction. But for people who want to have themselves always in the center, that just gets in the way of, because they're always too visible for effective manipulation around everything. Then there are tactics around what one might call a sort of popular, well, I don't know whether we call it election or choice, public sort of buy-in, follower buy-in. And some of the tactics around gaining follower buy-in are quite different for people who really enjoy the pleasures of identity. A lot of that is about charisma and self. Whereas, so anyway, I think it's a different thesis. We can move into the tactics of power. I have written about this in relation to Napoleon.
So we are almost there. You were talking about the politics and the tactics of power to navigate politics in organizations.
Yeah.
So would you want to complete that, Jonathan?
Oh, well, I'll just say that I think that there are, in politics, we can observe people become really good at different kinds of tactics. And for some of them, these are the sort of tactics where they themselves individually are up front and sort of representing. Others become more tactically involved in policy making, in crafting the law, and so on. So I think you can see, and some are in alliance building and building networks of alliances. So I think you can see how those pleasures map onto different kinds of political tactics.
Yeah. So there's a question that I have on this, and Sushant also writes the question, and I think this would be a last question for the day. It is on power and politics as well. When as a leader I take a decision, there will always be somebody who would be unhappy. And you did mention this when you talked about political activity in organizations, different groups having their own interests. So there would always be a group that would be unhappy with what I am doing, the decisions I make. And I don't know whether that decision would be right in the future, right? I take the decision thinking about the present. What is the best information I have? I make a decision. How does one remain sane, sensible, and continue making right decisions and still be neutral in the process? So when you have these kinds of blame game politicking that happens, how do you retain your sensibilities and still keep doing the right thing, because there are so many critics around?
Yes. I think people do this in different ways, and I haven't really. It's a great question, and I think I need to think about it a bit more. But for some people, you see with some CEOs, for example, they cut themselves off really from the rest of the operation. I remember one British corporation I did some work with for a long time. The chief executive had his own elevator, so he would come into the building through his own door and go up his own elevator and go to his office at the top and never see anybody unless he wanted to see them, and then he called them up to his top floor. So his sense of he maintained a distance. For him, I think the operation of the organization was a kind of portfolio of activities that was producing a wealth, and that's what he was balancing. So he remained distant from the human and the personal, and if people liked it or not wasn't really the main thing for him. And I think there are others who are very different, who sort of walk the floor and mix with people and get a feel for what the sense of tolerance for change might be, what the knowledge and information, the weak signals of coming from customers, from the market could be, and make use of that kind of intimate connection and sensitivity to the operations would be. And for those people, perhaps the danger is becoming sort of captured by that. And there, I think, a sense in leadership of having, you need your own sort of leadership group. You need to belong to your own leadership group and have your executive team. And I come back to the question of governance, the value of some non-executive advisors is, I think, very, very helpful.
So I think it has been very useful listening to your ideas. And as you're aware, I did write a book recently on the Mahabharata and leadership lessons. And I was listening to your ideas of identity, influence, and interaction, and the way you kind of put them in a hierarchy. And I could not, and you have already read the book, so I think I could slot, listening to you, I could slot the characters as well. So Kern was very clear on the identity bit. You need to have that identity. Same was Ashwatthama. I need to have that identity. And then there was the influence bit, which was Bhishma and Kunti. So there are two characters that we write about in the book, looking to do good and good for. And then there's the third kind, the higher level, as you say, the senior level people, Shakuni and Krishna, kind of trying to navigate the relationships and trying to maneuver the whole thing. So in the book, actually, we did mention that it's kind of arranged in a pyramid, as you did mention the hierarchy, and there's a kind of subsuming of these pleasures. So it has been wonderful. And there, personally, I had my many takeaways, Jonathan, the idea of identity, influence, interaction, and the pleasure. So one of the lessons we can all take away is that power is not always bad, and there are important pleasures that one needs to derive. Only then would you be actually able to engage with the thought of power. And when it comes to, and the beautiful thought that you gave, Jonathan, on you've got to balance these, and humility balances identity, justice balances influence. The virtue of justice would balance the dark side or the negatives or the perverse incentives of influence, and compassion would balance the perverse kind of incentives for compassion. And then there's, how should we use this in our organizations? Well, next time you have a problem or you are in a situation, ask yourself, what is the pleasure that I can derive out of it? Why should I be doing it? And then what are the pleasures? If you don't find a pleasure, like Steve Jobs famously said in his Stanford address, well, if you don't find something interesting for long, that's a signal for you to change and change what you are doing. So think about the right pleasures. Why should I do it? Why do I think about my identity? Why do I think about my influence, and so on? So all in all, wonderful ideas, Jonathan. I think I'm sure we can all take away and at least begin to think about some of these pleasures as we go in about our daily jobs and daily activities. It has always been wonderful interacting with you and listening to your views. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for accepting our invitation and taking out your time to be a part of the leadership conversations at the Ashank Desai Centre for Leadership and Organisation Development.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I enjoyed it and thought-provoking.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody, for joining in as well. And we stay tuned in. Keep checking our website for the next announcements of the activities at the center. Thank you very much for joining in. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for being a part of this conversation.